problem spot in this regards in the world. The Middle East is now full of American bases, and as a result, Americans have been able to use them to invade countries, to threaten other countries. So, and this has caused instability in itself. One of the ironies is that a lot of the instability that we see today in Africa is as a result of U.S. and European military policies. The fact that they bombed Libya, destroyed the country's infrastructure, and tried to bring about regime change through military means, this has itself caused a lot of the problems that we see now in Mali and beyond. So the United States and France and other countries, they are part of the problem. They're not a part of the solution. And so the Americans, on the one hand, they're creating a problem. They're creating great instability along with their allies. Yet on the other hand, they use this as an excuse to establish themselves in the Middle East, or in West Asia to be more precise, and across Africa. And this creates influence, and it also creates further instability because people do not like countries like the United States to base their forces in their countries.
All right. Emmanuel, do you agree a lot of the problems that are caused by the extension of terrorism here in Africa are actually a cause or as a result of interference or foreign interference?
I think the problems have been exacerbated by some of the foreign interventions, but they're not caused by these foreign interventions. If we take examples like Somalia, or even if Boko Haram or the Lord's Resistance Army, these problems are born out of specific structural conditions, issues around, if it is in Uganda, marginalization of northern Uganda, in other places, out of socio-economic and political grievances within these contexts. But attempts to intervene militarily has created a problem. If you look, for instance, in Somalia, where the US went in, supported Ethiopia in 2006 to try to drive out the Islamic Courts Union, it is what created the Al-Shabaab. So interventions have made the problems worse, but they're not the root cause of the problem.
All right, let's cross over to London. Alex Vines, the Director of Regional and Security Studies at Chatham House, is joining us from London, and still with us from Tehran is Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, and Emmanuel Kisiangani is still here with us in studio. Alex, I just want to get your thoughts on the deployment of U.S. military this year, 2013, in as many as 35 African countries. What do you know about that? What do you know about the intentions of the U.S. government?
Well, the U.S. government sees the peace and security in Africa as an important part of their interests globally, and so that is why the Africa Command was created a number of years ago. Previously to that, the creation of US AFRICOM, Africa had been managed militarily from the US perspective by a number of commands. So it shows the growing importance of Africa that the US decided to have a dedicated command focused on peace and security in Africa.
It shows the growing importance of Africa. But according to AFRICOM, though, the alleged purpose of the U.S. military involvement in Africa is to oversee American operations on the African continent to promote U.S. national and security objectives. What do they refer to as national security objectives? What are these objectives?
Well, counterterrorism is a key one, and that's certainly the case in what your panelists have been discussing in terms of Somalia, but also in the Sahel and North Africa. Energy security and also peaceful trade through the corridors of trade, including anti-piracy operations, is another. So those are the key planks of US policy. I mean, it isn't to say that Africa is a high priority for the US. This is not in comparison with the South China Sea or India, Pakistan. Those sorts of places are much higher in terms of a priority for the US. But Africa is seen as an area that the US should more coherently engage in. And that's why the US Africa Command was created and continues to operate on the continent.
Do we see these objectives, though, Emmanuel, as also tying in with the aspirations of African countries? Because in the case of Libya, for instance, the African Union complained rather loudly last year about NATO's, overrunning Libya, while the African Union was still negotiating on that issue. Do these objectives are they in tandem with Africa's own aspirations?
I don't think so. I attended one of those meetings where one of the officials of AFRICOM in Pretoria came to sell that idea of trying to establish an AFRICOM base in Southern Africa. And there was a lot of resistance. I think the fundamental issue is that the priorities for the US, like which Alex Van has mentioned, are not necessarily the priorities of African countries. We are concerned with basic things. Having food on a table, how to survive on a daily basis. Terrorism is not at the top of, it's a priority, but not at the top of that list. So that is why I'm just saying that the US may have those priorities, but not necessarily the priorities of African citizens. They may be, to an extent, be acceptable to African governments, but I doubt if they're acceptable, rather priorities for African citizens.
Alex, do you agree sometimes these national security objectives are not in tandem with Africa's aspirations, for instance, terrorism?
Oh, of course. The US has its own national interests and its strategic ambitions, and African countries have theirs. The African Union itself doesn't reflect what the actual individual states necessarily of Africa have in terms of their own ambitions. I mean, take the events around Libya in 2011. Nigeria and South Africa voted for a Security Council resolution. South Africa then changed its mind a little later on. Nigeria remained consistent. So there's not coherency necessarily in terms of a Pan-African vision of security. So we shouldn't be surprised by that at all.
All right. Dr. Marandi, in Tehran, terrorism often linked with U.S. military presence here on the continent. Is the U.S., though, do you think, using fighting Islamic jihadists as an excuse to expand its military presence on the continent?
Well, I believe that it is an excuse, but it's also the very fact that we have these so-called Islamic extremists is because of the U.S. and European policy itself. The United States, by allowing its client regimes in the Persian Gulf region, the dictatorships there, to fund extremists, even in countries like Nigeria, as well as the Middle East, they have helped extremists gain the upper hand in many parts of Africa as well as the Middle East. In Syria, for example, right now, as well as in Libya, we have extremists that were non-existent 2-3 years ago. Extremists that are both sectarian, that pursue racial hatred, and in many cases religious hatred. And you have televisions funded by the Saudis and others that advocate this sort of thing. So on the one hand, when the United States attacks Libya or supports extremists through these countries, in countries like Syria, it's natural that it is not going to be contained in these countries. Thus you have the terrorists taking hostages now in Algeria. You cannot contain terrorism and extremism when you yourself help advocate them for short-term gains. And now the situation in Mali is as such that as the United States and allows the French to continue bombing this part of the world, you're going to have greater hostility and towards the United States, towards Western countries, among the local populations, especially when innocent people are killed, and especially among others who do not live in that region, yet who are angered by these constant invasions of one country after another. And that, combined with the extremist ideology being exported by client regimes, is going to make the situation far more dangerous than what we've seen before.
Do you see, though, that militarizing that war against extremism in Africa as the way to go? Because you talk about more serious problems arising from the French and the US intervention there in northern Mali.
No, I mean, I think that that's the way in which the United States is going to go. It's going to militarize Africa just as it has militarized the Middle East. But one reason why the United States is so widely hated in the Middle East is because of its strong military presence in all the major countries. The United States has tens of military bases in the region, and through them it not only threatens countries, but it tries to put pressure on countries, and this angers the local population. And so, for example, right now you have constant drone attacks in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. They're not being monitored by any of the independent countries of the region. People are being killed, and the United States is answerable to no one. And this is just creating a more difficult situation. When the United States presence in Africa increases, this sort of thing will most probably increase as well. And therefore, it's at the end of the day, it hurts the United States more than anyone else, especially since it has so many inconsistent policies.
All right.
In Syria, it supports extremists. In Libya, it supported extremists, yet they bombed them, in the same sort of people in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia, and in Mali.
All right, Dr. Seyed Mohammad Marandi will return to this discussion in a moment. Also, still with us, Alex Vines and Emmanuel Kisiangani. We will return to this discussion in a moment. So is militarization the solution to violent extremism and conflicts in Africa? Or has Africa become another theater of Cold War-like ideological battles between the East and the West? Still with us on this program is Alex Vines, the Director of Regional and Security Studies at Chatham House in London. And from Tehran, Dr. Seyed Marandi, the Director of the Institute for North American and European Studies. And also still with us here in studio is Emmanuel Kisiangani, a Senior Researcher, Institute for Security Studies here in Nairobi. Alex, first to you. Dr. Marandi, as we were going to the break, noted that perhaps the kind of scenarios we are witnessing in the Middle East might be replicated in Africa if the militarization of terrorism continues across the continent. You agree?
No, I don't. I think Dr. Marandi shows that he's an expert in other parts of the world, but not on Africa at all. Much of Africa is experiencing impressive economic growth. There is a burgeoning middle class. There's prosperity. This is not a continent of famine and counter-terrorism and all the disasters that he has been talking about at all. So it's a very different continent. There are patches of instability. We've talked about the Horn. There's clearly the very serious crisis at the moment in the north of Mali, which hasn't been, the response there wasn't encouraged by the United States at all. The US, from my understanding, didn't want to get engaged in any military activities at the moment. There was a UN Security Council resolution mandating a roadmap which is advocating negotiations with the militant groups in the north, pending a military operation in the autumn if it failed. It's the jihadist groups and their launch of a offensive last week on Bamako that has provoked the French intervention there, which was called by the Malian government and has been supported by the Economic Community of Western African States and also the African Union. So I think this is a very different picture, actually, from the one that our speaker from Tehran was depicting.
But there are, extremist activities with the likes of Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and now what is happening across North Africa, in Mali, in the north of Mali. Perhaps some saying that what is happening in Mali was fueled by the situation in Libya.
Well, the crisis in Mali clearly suffered from blowback from Libya. So the events of 2011 absolutely they have contributed to the crisis in Mali. But as in the earlier part of the debate that your speaker from Nairobi was saying, the core issues here are all about are African ones. The crisis in Mali, in northern Mali, is about exclusion and disenfranchisement in the north of Mali, and then ungoverned space that's been corrupted by organized crime and radical groups, many of them that are nothing to do with Mali itself. Nigeria, Boko Haram, it's the same thing. There is obviously when these things become tied into international crime and international terrorism, they become a global issue, which is why there is a UN Security Council resolution mandating action in northern Mali. It is a truly international issue. It's not just about the West Africa region or even North Africa region. It is a global one.
All right, Emmanuel, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, like we have observed before, issues of extremism are born out of social, economic, and political considerations. I mean, issues around poor governance, issues around marginalization. And my argument is that while military interventions broadly may help in conflict management plans, we talk of managing conflict, we talk of resolving all those definitions. So it may manage the problem, but it doesn't address the root causes, which are, like Alex Van has observed, issues around structural inequalities, etc. So a fundamental aspect is, aside from the military interventions, there is also need to have a program that addresses these other grievances, economic grievances, and others, if we have to break this cycle of extremism around the continent.
All right, Alex, let's stay with the case of Mali and Somalia and Nigeria, though, for the moment. There is a clear ideological issue here. Now, are there other options of dealing with insurgency, do you think, as opposed to just the military option?
Oh, absolutely. The core route for a solution to all of these is not a military one. The original plan for Mali was a build-up to military action in September, October this year. Meanwhile, talking to the radical groups in the north of Mali, seeing if there could be negotiated settlement, and then isolating the very radical groups that just were bent on violence, and then having military action targeted against them. What wasn't expected was the offensive by 3 of the armed groups in northern Mali last week, which provoked the French response that we've been talking about.
All right. When you look at the Mali situation, though, there are reports that the Pentagon as well is preparing to provide military support to the French troops that are there. That French military intervention is already underway. Why would the U.S. be jumping onto the French bandwagon at this point?
Well, I disagree that it's a bandwagon. I think if the French hadn't intervened, we would have had jihadists in Bamako by now. The Malian military is useless. It is absolutely incompetent at dealing with a very motivated, well-armed threat. Yes, we have to accept that these groups have been armed and motivated out of their experience in Libya in 2011, and that's another debate whether that was right or wrong. But nobody wants to see a radical Islamist takeover of the whole of the Malian state. It's in nobody's interests at all for that to be, except if you have a radical jihadist agenda. So the US clearly is going to provide logistical support. My own personal worry on this is the following, that there is a UN Security Council resolution that has mandated action. The French, I think, have not necessarily operated under that resolution. The resolution advocates for the building up of African and international troops pending an operation later in the year. The point I'm making is that the Malian state and Malian military are ill-equipped to follow behind French or other troops to consolidate the areas that they might gain. So my hope is that France is just ensuring there's a buffer zone with the north, pending the UN Security Council mandated African roadmap, which was endorsed by the African Union, and prior to that, the Economic Community of West African States. The original plan is African. It is African, and it took from April till December to go through African processes. That is the most important thing.
All right, Dr. Marandi, do you agree with that assertion that sometimes it is the African countries or the African nations are incapable of dealing with this issue of insurgency, hence the need for foreign intervention?
Mali or any other country in Africa, most situations cannot be solved through military intervention. It is only going to create further instability, create anger, especially because Western countries have a history of both hegemony and imperialism, and when you carry out military attacks, innocent people die.
All right, from Tehran, Dr. Seyed Mohammad Marandi, Director of the Institute for North African and European Studies and a professor at the University of Tehran, and Alex Vines, Director of Regional and Security Studies at Chatham House in London. And also here in studio, Emmanuel Kisiangani, Senior Researcher, Institute for Security Studies here in Nairobi. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on the program today. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Bye-bye.